Sego, and welcome to Resistance Radio. That's what this is. This is Resistance Radio with John Kane and Regan DeLoggins. Look, we're closing this down. We're closing this down. This year's almost done, and we're going to talk a little bit about what this year has been. And it's not all bad news. I mean, it seems like there's bad news connected even with the good news, and we're going to talk about that. Regan and I will bring some of this conversation to you. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we're anticipating going forward. It's not like the calendar changes and all of a sudden everything's roses here, but there have been some things that we have done this year that we're going to continue to do, in spite of, without COVID-19. So we're gonna talk about some of that stuff. So first off, let me make sure, Regan, are you with me?
I'm here. I hope y'all can hear me okay.
Right. We can hear you fine. Hey, it's good to catch up with you. I'll say it, Happy New Year's Eve. I don't know. Is that a thing? I mean, I'm wishing you well for the new year. Put it that way.
Oh, I feel the same way. It's been a hell of a year, and I'm looking forward to it ending.
Yeah, and that's really what it comes down to. I want to talk about this past year, but I always feel somewhat compelled to talk about history, anniversaries, and that kind of stuff. And December is just a really, really bad month historically for Native people. And three events, specifically come to mind, but it doesn't stop with just three events. But I always talk about the day after Christmas with Mankato, Minnesota, and the execution of the Dakota 38. One of the things that disturbed me a little bit, I started to see, because now this is getting a little bit more traction, more and more people are talking about it each year, and I saw a lot more posts about the Dakota 38 and Lincoln being touted as not as the emancipator but as the executioner, and I saw some Snopes pages that were pulled up and like to check the veracity of whether calling Lincoln the executioner was whether it was justified or not. And Snopes tried to whitewash it a little bit. They said, well, it's partially true. I mean, they tried to deflect the fact that, to be clear, Abraham Lincoln signed the execution order for 39 Dakota for whatever reason. I don't know the details, but they actually executed 38. So one more of those who were destined for execution was able to escape that. He didn't escape far. Let me tell you that, because what Snopes started is, well, he commuted the sentence of 300 or 265 people or whatever else. Some of those people probably would have just have been hung than to have to die in prison, and that's what really happened with this stuff. I think it's important that people realize over 300 Native people were tried in a matter of a week or two in a military tribunal. They were tried, convicted, and all sentenced to death. And of course, Lincoln knew how this was already. He was in the throes of the Civil War, and he was afraid this was going to play badly. So he personally whittled the number down to something that he thought would satisfy the appetite of the good citizens of Mankato, Minnesota. So they got their big execution, but not so much that the world would condemn it. So, I'm a little troubled by how this gets whitewashed. He personally signed the execution order. He actually determined which of those who were convicted would die. He made that determination because, as far as the military tribunal, they were all going to die, as far as they were concerned. And frankly, they all did die. They all died, and most of them died right there in prison within a short period of time. Nobody talks about what happened to the 265 people who had their sentence supposedly commuted. But again, day after Christmas, and I posted a meme on Facebook and I said, imagine a people, what kind of society celebrates the day after they celebrate the birth of their savior. They continue that celebration by watching the largest mass execution in the history of the United States, and this being in Mankato, Minnesota, day after Christmas in 1862.
For those who are maybe unaware, I think it's important just to give a little bit more historical context, which is that the mass hangings that Abraham Lincoln uh, perpetrated happened because of a conflict known as the Dakota War, also known as the Sioux Uprising or the Dakota Uprising, and this is around 1862, in which there were a number of, I say skirmishes because that's often the terminology used, but I really hate that. But nonetheless, there was a number of skirmishes the river in southwest Minnesota of Dakota people and Sioux people, pushing back against the constant militarization and the constant violence happening within their communities as part of the American Civil War. And some of these skirmishes led to the obvious pushback from the U.S. government of the sentencing of 264 people. As John said, it was commuted, and 38 Dakota men were hung. And then in the following year, only I think it's like January, February, March, April. Yeah, 4 months later, the remainder of a huge amount of Dakota people were forced off of their land. Only 4 months after this execution, so it was more than just this is meant to be a consequence for people who armed themselves against the federal government, but also it was part of the larger conversation of the removal of Indigenous people off of the land, which is often not something discussed when we talk about Civil War history, which is something that my father and I talk a lot, is like what was happening outside of the Civil War in the rest of the world, but also what was happening outside of the Civil War beyond the battles of the North versus the South, if you will. There was a number of violent actions, especially against Indigenous people, because the Civil War was happening at the same time as westward expansion. They worked hand in hand with one another.
Well, and to put a finer point on that, in May of 1862 is when Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, and the Homestead Act was geared towards trying to reward anybody who would not take up arms against the United States. So because they are in the throes of the Civil War, so this is where people essentially would get free land for a filing fee. And where do you think that free land came from? So this was the largest transfer of native held lands. The United States just claimed it. Now, of course, they made promises with taking this land that they were going to, make sure that people were fed and that they were sustained and that kind of stuff. And they didn't fulfill those promises. The conflicts that came out of these Dakota Wars and these Sioux Wars, as they were described, was because the United States didn't uphold their end of the bargain. Native land became inundated with white people. And most of the people who took advantage of the Homestead Act weren't just, it wasn't like, what's the Little House on the Prairie? This wasn't, mom, dad, little girls on the prairie. No, that's not what happened here. Most of the people who took advantage of the Homestead Act were wealthy Eastern businessmen who took that land so they could make money off of it. They were either speculators who would turn around and resell the land, or they would find out. Obviously, there were minerals and gold and logging and pasturing. There are all kinds of things that they felt they could use this land for to make money. So the conflict that would ultimately lead in the charges against these men who were executed was born out of the United States most of the time committing these fraudulent land deals and then never fulfilling their obligation. There were people starving. The reason that Native people were raiding some of these settlement villages was because they didn't have any food. They weren't just trying to kill people. And make no mistake about it, the white people they knew that they were in an area that was somewhat hostile. They knew what they were doing was wrong and that it was going to breed conflict. So they went there ready and willing to kill Native people as well. So I think this thing oftentimes gets twisted around. Even on our side of the argument, I've heard people say, well, those people were executed just for hunting. No, that's not entirely true. But they were trying to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's something that I agree. When it comes to Christmas and people celebrating Christmas, and then the next day is like a really horrible day in history for Indigenous people, it can be an incredibly jarring switch to flip for folks. And maybe some people don't even have to switch, and they don't have to flip that switch. Maybe you're in a state of mourning toward the end of December anyway. But it's just something that I find I agree with what you were saying, John, in terms of people have been paying more attention to the Dakota 38. Indigenous people who are unaware, non-Indigenous people who are attempting to be accomplices in some way or another. So there's definitely more attention being brought to the Dakota 38. For me, whenever we do discuss the Dakota 38, what's important for me, for folks to understand, is that Abraham Lincoln, who everyone like loves because he freed the slaves, was no better than any president ever. You know, he was still a murderer. He was still a racist. He was still a capitalist. And so I really hate this like incredible fascination with Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, obviously, and JFK, when all three of them were incredible perpetrators of violence against people of color. So if folks are unaware of this, you know, this is the time to learn, shake it up, maybe buy a book, and really educate yourself on like the horrors that are the American presidencies.
Well, and that's why
Abraham Lincoln was no savior.
It's why in our language, our word is "Radagayas," and it means town destroyer. You know, and a further point with Lincoln that oftentimes gets missed. You made a good point earlier about these things being taken out of context, and they aren't set in the you know, against the backdrop of what else was happening either in the world or, you know, so a lot of these things are never talked about. Who was the president? The Sand Creek Massacre, which by many accounts was the most heinous act the United States committed, and I don't know how you weigh these things, but because of the mutilation, the fact that women were, you know, had their breasts, you know, cut off, and men had their genitalia cut off, and children were used for target practice, and it's all documented, you know, because it was so brutal. You know, there was a lot of pushback against Colonel Shivington, who was a Methodist minister of all things, who was responsible for this. But he's also responsible for lines like "nits make lice," which was also reiterated by Hitler, by the way. But this all happened during this was during the Lincoln administration, and he didn't hold anybody accountable. And so you have to say, if nobody was ever brought up, you know, for any kind of military charges for this, you know, for these heinous crimes, then you have to, you know, assume that the commander in chief was accepting responsibility for it. So, yeah, I have a hard time giving any of these guys a pass. But you know, and I think Lincoln, you know, gets undue praise as, you know, this great emancipator, this great, you know, fighter of freedom, and frankly, not just from a Native standpoint, but if you look at it through a Native lens, it ain't so pretty. It's not so pretty. Now, I want to mention,
then, you know, following.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that there are two other really notable events that took place at the tail end of the calendar year, and one was the Skeleton Cave Massacre, which was the Apache that were. And there was about 100 people that were hiding out, essentially, and the military came in and basically killed 76 men, women, and children, including toppling rocks upon them and that kind of thing. And that took place in Arizona territory, and that was 1872. That was December 28th. And then, of course, among the most famous atrocities committed against Native people was the massacre at Wounded Knee, which was in many ways direct retaliation because of the Little Bighorn and that kind of thing. It was the final, what is oftentimes referred to as the final chapter in the Indian Wars. It's not really, but it's the final big massacre that the United States was responsible for, and that took place on December 29th in 1890. And, you know, and the thing about bringing up something like 1890, many of us who knew our great-grandparents realized that they were alive then. So it wasn't like this was ancient history for those, especially for those of us who are getting up in years. But you know, my great-grandmother was alive in 1890. You know, so it's a little unsettling when I think about people looking at these things as if they were all old issues, and they carry forward. There's actually a monument, a veterans monument in Niagara Falls, out in this neck of the woods, where one of the individuals who was awarded a what is it, a Medal of Honor for shooting two Native people in a ditch. A guy by the name of Frederick Toy. There's a modern polished granite monument in Hyde Park in Niagara Falls, where they are commemorating this guy for his Medal of Honor for killing for this savage massacre at Wounded Knee. So this stuff comes forward. This isn't just something that happened, over 100 years ago that we can just kind of put in our rearview mirror. If you're a Native person, and there's a lot of Native people here in Western New York, between Tuscarora, the Senecas, the Tonawanda Senecas. So when we go to see this park, and some people are proud of their military service, Native people too, and then they've got to see that. I mean, this is how the trauma is carried forward.
Absolutely. I can't imagine having to witness those kinds. I mean, I say that like I haven't also experienced these celebrations of really horrible moments of genocide. Like there are so many, especially if you're someone who grew up going on road trips or driving around. You stop at somewhere that's a national monument, or you pull over the road to see something, and you quickly find out that a lot of these monuments are monuments of murder against Indigenous people. And I just want to rewind in case folks who are listening are unaware. The Wounded Knee Massacre, also known as the Battle of Wounded Knee, was a massacre of nearly 300 Lakota people by the United States Army. It did occur, as John said, in 1890 on December 29th. And this was on or near Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. And it's been described as a botched attempt to disarm the Lakota camp. But obviously, like what, botched or not, the reality was that 300 Lakota people, or nearly 300 Lakota people, were murdered, including women and children, in an incredibly heinous way. And as you were saying, I think it's important that we remind ourselves that even though these are events of the past, they are of the recent past. 1890 isn't that long ago in terms of the scheme of human history. And if folks are unaware of these historical moments, I really do advocate that you educate yourself, and also understand that there are some really horrible photographs, which is something that I have always been incredibly, as a primary source researcher, I've been always incredibly thankful when there are photographs of historic eras, especially for a number of reasons. It really provides context. But when it comes to the Wounded Knee Massacre, there are some really heinous and horrible photographs, which remind us that these massacres happened in a relatively modern period. They happened within the history of the United States. The United States is an incredibly young country, also, as a reminder for people who are unaware. So I do advocate that folks go out there and start to do some research on whether these larger, more well-known massacres like the Dakota 38, like the Wounded Knee Massacre, like Skeleton Cave, or maybe folks didn't even know about Skeleton Cave. Point is, there is an incredible legacy of these massacres throughout U.S. history, and I really advocate that folks become more educated about it. I think it will provide more critical knowledge, critical conversations about what the state of this country is.
Well, and when you hold some of those photos side by side with photos that are really very readily available, as far as the Jewish Holocaust. I mean, when you think about mass graves, I mean, I've seen a side by side comparison of mass graves where Jewish people who have been murdered were put into mass graves, and it looks exactly like the mass graves that the Lakota were being dumped into. I mean, it really is an atrocity, and so we bring this up because there are still people who know their family members from that time, and there were a few children who survived the Wounded Knee Massacre, and they would have to figure out how they reconcile that in their minds as they're raising children, and so we're not that many generations removed. And again, World War One, it wasn't long after this. And so when you think about World War One and then ultimately World War Two, and you realize that folks like Adolf Hitler used much of what was available in terms of history, and how the United States dealt with Native people, with a population that they didn't want. He took cues for that. I mean, he wrote about it in Mein Kampf, and he utilized some of what the lessons learned from how the United States dealt with Native people, as far as how he was going to deal with an unwanted population in a country that he ruled. So yeah, I mean, it's important that people understand some of this stuff. And again, I don't want to do a whole show on this, but when you're talking about doing a year end kind of show, and that's obviously we're doing a show here on the 31st of December. From a Native standpoint, we can't not talking about some of these things, because we are still dealing with this stuff. And when I think about the challenges that we have today with education, with how things are taught, I bring some of this stuff up because I think it's important that the listeners of WBAI and those of who are following, this is a podcast or a YouTube video or whatever on Facebook, that they understand that you were betrayed by your education. Your education was manipulated so you would not see these things. I realize that there are American heroes, and America likes to promote its heroes, and whether it's Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, whoever, Trump, I don't know, but we're trying to say is you're not getting the full picture. So what you've been delivered is a lie through omission. If you are going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation and ignore the fact that the largest mass execution in the history of the United States, I mean, think about a gallows that was constructed, one that was constructed like no other gallows in the history of the world, as far as anybody knows. The idea that they built this massive gallows that could basically snuff out the life of 40 people at one time, and they filled it with 38 people. And so this is American history. This was done on Abraham Lincoln's watch. He signed the order. So it's important that people understand the full picture. I mean, and that's the part that frustrates me, because whether it's Hollywood, whether it's history books, whether it's Disney, or whether it's, look, there's a lot of media out there, and many of the talking heads will not talk about this stuff. So we do it here. So I mean, and again, we are closing out a year, but I want to. Obviously, this has been one hell of a year. COVID-19 obviously dominated much of the conversation, but it wasn't the only tragedy. We had the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor that basically sparked life into a major resistance movement, one that you and I have both participated in at some levels. And I think it's important that people understand that even when positive change is pushed for, it usually comes in the wake of tragedy. So I mean, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about kind of where the social justice movement, how it manifested this year.
Yeah, I knew we were going to touch on this, and it's taken a lot for me not to cry when considering this past year. And obviously, as you said, COVID obviously is an incredibly horrid thing, that really shaped this year and will continue to shape years, because it's not going away, and all of us have been affected in a horrible way by it. So it's not like, whether economically or socially or however, we are all have been rewritten by our experience with COVID. But I think that for me, the most poignant part of this year was being in the streets with other people, advocating for Black lives. And it blows my mind, and I apologize for losing my cool, but whatever. It blows my mind that our Black relatives are murdered by the police in numbers too big to ignore, in the most violent and grotesque ways. And I'm so thankful to know and to be a part of an incredibly poignant part of history in which over 15 million people participated in the protest in honor of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Over 15 million people. That's an incredible amount of people to come together and realize that the police state is destructive and murderous. But I also find myself, I don't really love New Year's, but I find myself like looking back on the year, and I'm also incredibly disappointed because literally last night, a black man was killed by the police in Minneapolis. And the day before, or 2 days before, an indigenous man was attacked by the police on his own land in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these things continue to happen. Like, these incredibly horrid acts of violence perpetrated by the police or by militarized personnel or by the Park Service, whoever is the boot in this situation. Like, this is not going away. And so, the reason I'm getting so emotional is because I really hope that people carry this anger, this righteous anger, into the new year and don't just stop. Because my biggest fear with Joe Biden being elected was that people would stop showing up. And my biggest fear was realized in a lot of ways. A lot of accomplices and quote-unquote allies stopped showing up to do the work and left it to the labor of Black and Indigenous and other POC social justice organizers, community organizers, mutual aid organizers. A lot of the labor fell back on us in a really intense way. And so, for me, I see the movements are always happening because the movements always happen. They will never stop. People are still providing mutual aid. People are still organizing against the state. People are still organizing against the police. But I really feel like there was this moment of momentum where where everyone was really holding their breath for this awakened revolution, and I feel like it was missed. I feel like it was missed because of the distraction of a stupid election that means nothing. These elections mean nothing to me personally, and I believe to other people listening as well. But for me personally, these elections mean nothing. They are just distractions that maintain the status quo, and the status quo is racism, and the status quo is capitalism, and the status quo is continued degradation of Black and Indigenous and other people of color. And so for me, what does social justice movement look like in this time after the summer? I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that things will change, that people will get their shit back together, will really reorganize in a way that we were before, because Black people are still being murdered by the police. Black people will still be murdered by the police. This is a systemic issue. This isn't one person's life or another person's life. These are multiple people over the course of history whose lives are snuffed out by continued police violence.
Men, women, children. I mean, to me, they just completed their investigation on the killing of Tamir Rice, 12-year-old boy playing with an airsoft gun, a plastic gun, and he was shot by Cleveland police. And they said, "Wow, the footage was pretty grainy." So unless even when they have irrefutable video evidence, they can't seem to convict. I mean, and here you have a boy playing with his, with a Christmas present, and shot down. Police pulled up and just shot him. I mean, and no charges. So this is, so we've seen men and women and children that have been killed in this manner. So yeah, it is incredibly frustrating. And I always have to mention that although our population as Native people is small compared to any other population. I mean, look, we represent less than 1% of the U.S. population. Living on territory, we're less than less than 0.5%. But when you consider the rate that Native people are killed by cops, we are actually killed by cops at a higher rate than anybody else, except for within one specific demographic, the 16 to 24 age group. The overall rate of death by cop for Native people is the highest than among for any other people. So, and I'm not trying to make this into a contest, but I think it's easy to not acknowledge that this is a systemic problem that affects all people of color, and there is no system in place, and we've seen the Biden administration back down completely and avoid any real conversation about defunding police or any of that stuff, and so even as people try to make news of his cabinet being filled with diversity and everything else, it's frustrating. And we're going to take a break here, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about Deborah Haaland being put in as the head of the Interior Department. Because the problem is you have a centrist administration that even as they pull people who may have been more progressive than them, they're going to pull them back. And so there's going to be the kinds of compromise while everybody sits there and oohs and ahs about a Native person at a cabinet level. I'm thinking I'd rather see strong Native people beating on that cabinet, not being inside that cabinet. But we'll talk about that when we come back. Reggie, why don't you take us out with a little bit of a tune, and we'll come right back. Give me a chance to take a drink and maybe dry an eye. Hey, thanks for coming back. That's a little bit more Murray Porter, kind of our signature musician. We use him for the program, and I think it's important that people realize that is, he's making light of it a little bit in the song, but it comes down to this: what do we learn? What do we learn from the mistakes of the past? I mean, do we? Will we? I mean, to Regan's point before the break here. There is a problem that people are so desperate for a happy ending that so Trump gets voted out of office, and we'll see what happens later on in the month, with that. But that's not the end of the story, and so we have some major problems to deal with going forward, and nothing is solved with an election. Nothing is solved with an election. Now, can people be hopeful that there'll be some policy changes? Yeah, but. Look, from a Native standpoint and from a person of color standpoint, Biden was part of the Obama administration. Black people didn't fare very well with a black president. And I come back to the same thing when I considering all of the hype with Deborah Haaland being nominated for the Interior Secretary. So, I mean, I don't know. Give me your initial thoughts on the whole Deborah Haaland nomination.
I wrote a bit of a rant. Let's just call it a rant. Online when she was named as being nominated to be Secretary of the Interior. I think that if you are an assimilationist and like assimilationist policies, then this must feel like a win. Auntie Deb, I keep seeing Auntie Deb, the Be Fierce, there's so many GIFs and memes and all these things online in reference to Auntie Deb taking down,
the glass ceiling, right?
Yeah, truly, the glass ceiling. And, I'm incredibly disappointed. I'm disappointed more so by the reaction in Indian country. If she gets nominated, then or she is nominated rather, if she becomes Secretary of the Interior, there it is. But I think I'm more disappointed by people's reactions to, especially people who online have an incredible presence for being deemed as radical or progressive, celebrating what is really just assimilation at its best. You have an incredibly qualified, intelligent, indigenous woman who is participating in what will be, and as it always is, the continuation of settler colonialism. So for me, it's disappointing to see Deb Haaland in this position, and I would have hoped she would have said no, but I also don't like for a lot of reasons. And I think my biggest concern is that, she, though, again, qualified maybe for this position, she sponsored legislation that removed freedmen rights from the 5 civilized tribes, as they're called, including my own. And so she has a very long history of anti-blackness within Indian country, specific to this legislation that she pushed through that removed housing rights and tribal rights away from black freedmen, away from black indigenous people within the Southeast and Oklahoma. So for me, I find it to be really, really concerning that there is so much praise without critique. And though I've seen a number of people, especially online, a number of indigenous people bring up the fact that she has a legacy of anti-blackness, you still see so many people come to her aid saying things like, that may be true, but we finally have the first Native American in the presidential cabinet. And the reality is, like, I don't care about those things. I think they are distracting from the realities, and that's a perfect example, because her being nominated has suddenly expunged her record, which has actually been incredibly detrimental to black indigenous people. So for me, I think it's a disappointment. I think she's a disappointment. I think that people who are advocating for her in this like really intense way and ignoring the fact that she's done a lot of harm is also incredibly disappointing. And so I try not to give a lot of time or effort into it, but I'm almost unable to avoid it. And this is why I tell people that I don't believe that representation, whether in settler politics or in media or in brand campaigns, I don't believe Indigenous representation is necessary. I find it to be always tokenizing, and I think this is another example of that.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. I know I've taken my licks for being cynical about, and I'm being polite there, about her nomination. Yeah, I find it very, very troublesome. I mean, and then I hear people say something like, "Oh, but she was at Standing Rock." Well, Joe Biden was the vice president that caused that conflict. You know, he was a part of the administration that caused that conflict. So now she's on his team. I mean, and so when I see this, I'm thinking, how many people does she take with her? And we see it with all of the outpouring of hype surrounding her nomination. You know, how many people who should have been and should be critics are now just going to say, oh, no, we got something. Can I remind people that Mitch McConnell, once when he was addressing the issue of reparations, said, well, you had a black president. There's your reparations. Well, and so now we're supposed to say, oh, we had a Native person in the cabinet. There's everything's good now. We've been made whole. Yeah, again, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think you and I do share this sentiment. And look, you know, this show isn't, you and I don't compare notes before we do a show. And to the extent that you and I may not always agree with each other on certain things, that's what we do here with this program. And we try to offer a critical view. Look, there are a lot of voices out there. And look, there are Native people who make it in politics. I mean, I have to remind people that, you know, Charles Curtis was the vice president of the United States under Herbert Hoover. He was one of the worst politicians for Native people, and he was a congressman, a senator, and the vice president of the United States. And he oversaw some of the largest transfers of Native lands, especially in places like Oklahoma, you know, during his tenure as a U.S. politician. So when people say, yeah, we're gonna join the evil empire and fix it from within, yeah, not so much. Look, I do want to mention a couple of things that I do feel positive about this year. And even though they are born out of tragedy. So the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the fact that it didn't stay concentrated on one issue. We saw Columbus statues being toppled and removed right alongside the Confederate statues being removed. We saw the Washington football team, you know, the financial interests that support it finally saying, yeah, this social justice thing, you know, that's happening in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we may have to readjust, you know, our commitment towards a football team that uses a racial slur for its name. So the Washington football team dropped its name. The Cleveland baseball team dropped its name. And I realize that the mascot issue, many people can kind of minimize that. But the thing I'll say about the mascot issue is it's one thing I'll say about it is that we're winning that battle. We aren't necessarily winning all of the pipeline fights and some of these other. We're there and we're fighting it. And we hope to affect change with some of these things. But one of the things about changing mascots, especially at the school level, something that I'm currently involved in, is what you're doing is you're at least stopping this idea that children are being taught that Native people can be looked at in the rearview mirror as just these images of Hollywood images or Disney images on a 2D drawing on a football helmet, and that we aren't relics of the past. It's bad enough history is taught that way, but then it gets promoted even more when we are used for amusement and entertainment by predominantly white kids, non-Native kids, who can look at us and say, oh yeah, we can heroize the idea of Native people even as we condemn them. And I oftentimes cite the L. Frank Baum quote where he talks about the fact that he, in his view, and he wrote this just before the Wounded Knee Massacre, that we should be exterminated because our glory has fled, our manhood has been effaced, and it's better that we die the miserable wretches that we are, and then be remembered in later ages as the kings of the forest and the plain. I mean, this is how history has treated Native people, and mascots continue that. So, I mean, even as we see some of these things affecting change, I am optimistic, and I will be fighting even harder in 2021 than I have in this year. But I'm also not going to let the murders of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor go without making sure that we push back and we fight back so that people of color are that this oppression ceases. So this is my commitment on this thing. So I'm not going to sit there and talk about Happy New Year, but I am looking forward to to what the resistance is going to look like in 2021.
I totally agree. I think that's something that I really want people to understand is that there is momentum. And it's something that I have to remind myself as well, is that there is momentum. There is energy behind this. And even at times when it feels like, social movements have been co-opted by neoliberal models, or social movements have been co-opted by nonprofits, or because that's the reality of social movements. As soon as they become popularized, then they need to be consumed, and then we must capitalize off of them.
Yeah.
So we see that happening in the same. We've seen that happen many times with social movements. But there is momentum. That even though we see these co-options happen, and even though we might be disappointed by the way social movements shift and change, there are still pockets of true radicalization happening, true progression happening, and that we must carry that in. We have to bring the legacy of those who have been abused by settler colonialism, whether by the police state, whether by capitalism. Like, we must continue and must bring the momentum with us forward and continue doing the work, because the work has to be done.
And we're the only ones who are going to do it.
And abolishment, then we have to do it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I was hoping to at least get a couple of calls in. So maybe, Reggie, if you can set up, we'll do a few calls as we wind down here. The number to call in to give it maybe some farewell thoughts to the year. I don't know, some optimism for the upcoming year. 212-209-2877. That's 212-209-2877. And while I'm giving that number out, let me remind people that this is listener-supported radio. And we need your support. So I'm going to also give the pledge line, which is 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to make a pledge of any size. You can do a timed donation. You can do a weekly donation. You can do a one-time donation. But we really do need your support. On that note, let me also make a mention that Resistance Radio with Regan and John is actually going to be carried by WPFW in Washington, D.C. We'll start the new year with that. So we will be broadcasting not only live on WBAI on Thursdays at 3 o'clock, but we will be the show will also be aired on Fridays at 2 p.m. in Washington, D.C. So the WPFW crowd, the D.C. market is going to it's going to get invaded by John and Regan, and we're going to carry this message forward. And we're going. I mean, we're not softening the show. I mean, look, we're not really going to scale this thing back. So, perhaps somebody will tune in a radio for Deb Haaland while she's in Washington, D.C., and she'll have to hear some of what we're delivering here. So that's what we're looking forward to next year. And, I think it's important that people realize that Pacifica does provide a platform for our voices, for, look, the idea of calling our show Resistance Radio isn't brand new. WBAI has been dubbed Resistance Radio for years. We just kind of hijacked it a little bit. Yes, we did appropriate it. Only this one's Resistance Radio with John and Regan.
Okay, and on that note, John, we have 4 callers, and I'm looking at the clock. So I think the two of y'all have to do your due diligence to go.
Yeah, we're gonna have to be quick. So
we'll do it quick. Rapid fire.
We'll see what we can get through. So callers, please give your comments quickly if you can. We only have about a little over 5 minutes left. So we'd love to hear from you. We just had a lot to finish up. So caller, you're up first. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, how you doing? Every time the American people get to speak on BAI, we don't have too much time. But anyway, I'm very optimistic about creating a genuine progressive movement in the future and have people understand that the statues, those black buffalo soldiers that were mass murderers of American Indians, were not taken down.
All right. Of all the statues that you could bring up, and of course I know who this is, and we can go on to another caller here. Look, the only time I even bring up Buffalo Soldiers is when somebody tries to is to counter the whole idea that when people try to exaggerate or embellish the slaveholding of Native people. Look, every one of our cultures have had people that have had parts of our culture that have been taken over, and so that's not unusual here. So look, I'm not a fan of Buffalo Soldiers, but the impact that black Buffalo Soldiers have had on Native people is minimal compared to some of the statues and some of the people that are heroized in American history. So we can go on that. I don't know. Do you have a comment on that, Regan?
Also, it's important. Well, I just want to say it's also important to note that harms that have been done against black people by indigenous people and indigenous people by black people, that is done through the crux of settler colonialism purposefully to divide us, and often those histories are embellished in order to maintain that division. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Obviously, who armed and directed these Buffalo Soldiers? I mean, let's keep that in mind. All right, Reggie, go ahead and give me the next caller. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hello, this is T. I'm calling from Rockland County.
Good to hear from you.
So blessed to be on the phone with you two. No, really, it's good to hear from y'all. Okay, and I'm so grateful that the previous person came on before me, because it just illustrates what's on my mind. I'm thankful for all those people that voted for Trump. I'm hoping it awakens the eyes of all of us brown-skinned, melatonin people, because we need to know who the enemy is and what they really want. And we keep pretending. We're such a forgiving, loving people. We really are. And we keep going back and putting our hand out, and they keep spitting in it. So I'm grateful for the voting we just had, the millions of people that just decided that they wanted you to know they don't give a damn if you know that they're racist. They don't give a damn if you know that they're selfish. They don't give a damn about anything but themselves. And so now that they've yelled that to the top of the world, then we should all know what we're dealing with and work accordingly. I'm grateful for that.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Man, those words resonate. I can't say what I want to say because it includes a lot of cursing, but just know that those words really resonate with me. Thank you.
Yes, I appreciate that. And look, I'm glad to see people that want to still keep the Trump flags up because it tells me who they are. And, it makes it easier to identify them. Same with Confederate flags. So I'll say that. All right, Reggie, we'll get one more before we got to go to break, I think. So let's try another one.
Okay.
All right, caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
This is Greg from Hewlett, New Jersey.
Hey, Greg.
Next year's a lot better than the past one. Okay, real quick. 1862, Mankato. I've been to Mankato. That was a horrible thing that happened for sure. But Abraham Lincoln at that point was dealing. Are you familiar with the Battle of Fredericksburg that happened 2 weeks before? Come on, American history here.
What's your? Yeah, go ahead.
Are you asking?
12,500 federal soldiers were shot down before a stone wall at Fredericksburg. Of which 5,000 guys in Hancock's Court, 2,000 of them were gunned down. When they got back to their camp, there was literally 2,000 empty chairs, if you will, of men, most of who were Irish and German Catholics and abolitionists from the North. That was a sacrifice of 2,000 people in a couple hours to free people. That was what I think was on Lincoln's mind more than Mankato. In fact, quite frankly, Minnesota at that point was in the far northwest. Lincoln is a hero if you consider the context of what was happening. A couple weeks before that was Antietam.
All right. Well, again, it's in your context, he's a hero, but you weren't freed by Lincoln. And who were those people shot by? They were shot by other white people. And those are some of the same white people that put Trump into office. The same mentality and that kind of stuff. So don't suggest that somehow, that Lincoln put the rest and united the country. Well, come on, give me a freaking break. And those people weren't killed because of the color of their skin. And I think it's important that people put this stuff in perspective. I don't know. Go ahead, Regan.
I mean, they died because of a war that was started by white men because of their inability or their lack of wanting to free black people. So I personally, I cannot relate to this argument because as the historian, I know it's wrong.
Yeah.
So I can't relate to what's being. I will say that he did it because it was a part of the necessity in order to maintain, quote unquote, the union. These things aren't done because presidents care about their people. Presidents maintain the status quo. And as I said previously, the status quo is racism and capitalism. Yeah. So, he may or may not have had his mind on something else, but you know what? He was in a state of mind to still order the execution of 38 people.
He went back and forth.
So great to me.
He committed himself to this. I mean, he knew that executing 300 would be too many. So he actually rationalized what number was appropriate for him to sign the execution order for. So don't tell me it wasn't on his mind.
Also,
he played a role in it.
Also, if he was feeling so bad about the loss of so much life, maybe don't kill more people.
Yeah, there's a thought.
Throwing that out there.
Yeah, there's a thought. Well, again, I want to thank.
Okay, we have one more caller, and we can knock this out if you want to.
All right, let's try it real quick. Caller, you're the last caller, so let's real quick. Go ahead.
Hi, John. This is Matt from Brooklyn.
Hey, how you doing?
No time. Hey, pretty good. I just want to call your attention to a particular book. It's called Islands at the Center of the World by Russell Shorto. He uncovered a whole history that was obliterated between of a Dutch colony that was here in New York. And he describes the interaction between the Dutch, the Brits, Spanish, the Native, the Onahi, the Mohawk, the Mohicans, and what happened, the conflicts that arose, and how different groups tried to solve it, and maintain their issues.
Give me the name of the book again, Matt, would you please?
It's called Island at the Center of the World. It's a very good book.
All right, we'll post that up. I know we're just about out of time. So Matt, thank you. It's good to hear your voice too, man. It's good to hear from you, man. It's good to hear you. Look, I want to thank people for listening. I want to thank you for supporting the show this year. We need to continue to support the program, support the station. Again, the number to make a donation is 516-620-3602. I look forward to Regan and I bringing more of this in 2021. I want to thank you, Regan, for being a part of this program and to being my partner here. And I look forward to giving it to the folks down in D.C.
Me too. I can't wait.
All right. Again, Reggie, I want to thank you so much for your support and for the work that you do. And I wish you a happy New Year. I mean, whatever that means in this world today.
Whatever that means.
Whatever that
I
means.
understand, to the both of you.
All right. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you in the new year. Yahweh.